So I actually always joke that it's hard to say any prayer without at least 100 Catholics in the room. And it does personally kind of crack me up that suddenly I forgot the Confiteor, which I probably said 10,000 times in my life. But it's a little bit of humility, and humility is a good thing. So it kind of cracks me up. But there is this story, and it's the oldest story written in human history. It's the first story ever written. And we call it the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's this profound story. And it's this character, Gilgamesh, he's a teenager. And to be honest, he's strong, but he is selfish and really kind of brutal. And the gods, to bring him out of it, the gods decide to make him actually a best friend. And so they make this friend, and he's called Enkidu. And he is just as strong as Gilgamesh, but also kind of the opposite. So together, they'll become one great human being. And Gilgamesh meets Enkidu, and the first thing to do is fight. They actually wrestle, which sounds strange, but this story was written 6,000 years ago. And it kind of cracks me up on this side because they did these studies on how children create friendships. And little girls, they often sit face to face. And to bond a friendship, they'll actually tell a secret about themselves or somebody else. What they found with little boys usually don't face to face. They usually sit side by side looking out. And little boys usually make friendships through competition, either being on the same team or opposed. So I love in this 6,000-year-old story, they become friends because they fight together and neither one can win. So they become great friends. And in this friendship, they go on this adventure to kill this monster named Hubaba, who lives in the cedared forests of Lebanon. And they go and they conquer this beast and they come back. And they're just unstoppable. And this worries the gods because humanity so united can almost do anything. So the goddess Ishtar comes down and says to Gilgamesh that she wants to take him as her consort. And Gilgamesh knows that Ishtar has a habit of killing people. She's really not that nice. So he says no. And then Enkidu takes the leg of a bull and slaps her in the face with it. And they both laugh, and they break up laughing that they just slapped her in the face. And, of course, she's mad. And she gives Enkidu death. And Enkidu dies with Gilgamesh holding him in his arms. And this, seeing his best friend who he loved die, disturbs Gilgamesh. Not only that he lost his best friend, but suddenly Gilgamesh, who always seems so powerful, realizes just how fleeting and fragile life is. And this so disturbs him that he takes this kind of adventure. First, in escapism, trying to avoid the idea of death. Secondly, in kind of hedonism of drink and dance and women. But that doesn't do any good. And he realizes that's just a form of cowardice. You're just running away. So he takes this journey, this quest, to find Noah, of Noah's Ark, except they call him Utnapishtim. And he finds Noah, and when he finds Noah, the old man, Noah says to him, "Why are you being a fool? Why do you spend your strength in such silliness?" And Noah gives him a speech about you have to discover your purpose in life. We will all die, but you can become a true human being. So Gilgamesh goes back to the city, and he becomes this great king. And he spends his life pouring out to make life as good as possible for his people. And it's this great story, but the story is not about how great his adventures were. He's not a hero because of the adventures. He's a hero because of what he learned. And the title for this story is really not the Epic of Gilgamesh. Its original title was the man who looked in the deep, which I love. He looked at death and became a true human being. The rest of his life, all his adventures, were really just escapism. He looked at death. And the last line is kind of haunting because it says, the day your umbilical cord is cut, you do not want to spend your life with your heart knotted in anger and selfishness. And I love that. To become a true human being, you have to look into the deep and make sure your heart is not knotted in anger and selfishness. And the opening line of the story is the best line of any story ever. And the opening line says, "This is an ancient story that can be still told today." And I like that. It's an ancient story. It's literally the oldest story in humanity. But also today, in a way, we're hoping it's our story because all the readings deal with looking at death. Today it becomes our story if we look into the deep, look into death and try and become true human beings. So the gospel, once again, is dealing with death. It's the death of Lazarus, except in the gospel, we're Lazarus. We're the ones who have to look and see that in some ways we're in our own graves, that we will die. And we're in the grave, and we're Lazarus who hears the call of Christ to come to a fuller life. That's what we're hoping. We're hoping we're the people who can look into the deep. Or it's also this true. We're also hoping that we're the crowd. It's a crowd that Christ orders, untie him. So we're the ones who are supposed to untie those things that bind people in death. But we're also supposed to be Lazarus and look at what things have tied us to death. I love this. And in the story, Christ is not trying to stop death. If you notice the opening of the story, it says that he waited 4 days. Now in Judaism, that means something. For 3 days after you have died, you're in Judaism, you're considered mostly dead, not completely dead. On the 4th day, you're considered completely dead. That's why it comes on the 4th day. And what it means is Christ is not going to save us from death. No, what Christ is going to do is bring us through death. We must look at death and pass through it to have a completely new life. Not return us to our old life, but bring us to a new life. And one of the just particulars that I love is Jesus, it mentions, gets angry. Except the word in Greek is not anger in the sense of hatred. It's anger, there's a Greek word, we don't have one in English, that means mourning to the point of anger. Like I would have chose like the description of furious love. And sometimes in your life you can see it. Like when I was growing up, our oldest cousin, Chris, who was just a great person, he died of cancer. And my favorite aunt, Aunt Nancy, she was so angry at Chris's death. That was a furious love. She actually ends up being one of the funniest people, I think, ever. Her and my Uncle Bill, we went to a casino once, and all they ever did was laugh and laugh. But I've seen that furious love that is upset with death itself. Or I used to work with this woman, Mary Culloch, who tells a story that when she was living in Chicago, she found out one person in the neighborhood was a drug dealer. And she sees him and kind of loses it. Man, she's usually very sweet. She loses it and starts to yell, "Drug dealer, drug dealer, drug dealer! You should be ashamed of yourself!" And what she was a mother who's gone crazy with furious, angry love because she considered that a threat to the life of her children. So when it says Jesus was perturbed or angry, it's really a furious love. And what he's furious with is death. It was never meant to be this way, that human beings suffer and loss that death causes. He's angry at death. And he calls Lazarus forward and calls Lazarus out of his tomb, and that's what we're hoping as well. To be untied from the bonds of death, to help other people be untied with the bonds of death. That's what our community is supposed to do. That's why we say we are holy apostles. Or the first reading, once again, deals with death, except it's the story of the dry bones in the valley. But here's the thing. It is a story of moving, when the Messiah comes, will move us from death to a new life. But in the story, the Messiah, it doesn't just raise an individual to new life. And this is a big difference between Judaism and Catholicism versus kind of evangelical Christianity. Not that it's bad, but evangelical Christianity paints a picture where you're saved individually. For Jews and Catholics, we storm the gates of heaven together. In the Valley of the Dry Bones, the Messiah calls a community to life, and a community journeys to the promised land together. We are holy apostles. We move from death to life together. And on this weekend, all throughout the world, this is in Catholicism what's called the third scrutiny. For those who are entering the church, we pray the third scrutiny. And the third scrutiny is about cosmic sin. Cosmic sin is death. That on this weekend, we have like 80, 90 people who are entering the church, and we'll pray for them. That they join us in looking at cosmic sin, looking at death itself. We are the people who look into the deep to make sure our hearts aren't tied with anger or selfishness. We look at death. And when we pray for them, I ask all those who are entering the church, I'll ask you to kneel, but you're going to join with us in looking at death. And so in some ways, the story of Gilgamesh is true today. This is a very ancient story that is told today. With Christ, we look at death, and he calls us to a new life. And so let us offer our prayers for the needs of the world.